I'm going to talk about the part that RIVERKEEPER specializes in more, and that I particularly specialize in, which is the on-water part of this equation and the actual vessel movement part of the equation. And both Andy and I have tried to boil this down because we think that the Q&A part is going to bring out a lot of the details, and they'll be the details you actually want. But it is important to discuss the overall picture here. Very basics. Industry has proposed 43 new berths or anchoring locations at 10 different areas. So, 10 zones of the river, and in those 10 zones, total of 43 berths or spots where vessels would be authorized to anchor. And so it's important for you all to understand how that varies from the current condition. And we are, just for sake of clarity, we're talking about the GW Bridge and north. New York Harbor is a whole nother thing. It's full of vessels, has multiple anchorage areas, has Coast Guard vessel traffic that controls all vessel movements. So this is GW Bridge and north. The existing situation is that there's an authorized official anchorage at Yonkers. There's an authorized and official anchorage at Hyde Park. And until the fall of 2015, there was an unofficial but used anchorage between Port Ewan and Rhinecliff. And Carolyn's going to address how that factored into her quality of life and the people in your community here. So that was 3 spots, 2 authorized and 1 not. Now, remember, they're asking for 43 berths. In my 16 years of patrol on the Hudson, I have never seen even a half-dozen vessels anchored in the stretch from the GW Bridge all the way to the Troy Dam. So when we saw this proposal, first question virtually is, if you're never using 6 anchorage locations currently, why do you need 43? Why does the industry need 43? And frankly, we don't have an answer yet. And as part of what will come out today is the back and forth between ourselves and industry reps that has taken place so far. And I'm afraid that the answers I'm getting to the questions about why they need things, why they need these anchorages, is not really getting any clearer. The main argument that industry makes, and this is very important because this is the critical argument that the Coast Guard is going to listen to. Industry's saying they need these anchorages for safety. And at a meeting Monday night in Ulster County, the industry rep said, you don't want a spill in the Hudson, do you? You don't want an accident. You don't want a mariner to drive while the conditions continue navigating while the conditions are bad. Visibility's poor, crosswind's so strong they can't maintain their course, ice, whatever. He invoked all these hazards to navigation. Now, that's a very valid argument, and we're going to have to deal with it. We're not going to be able to say safety's, and nor do we want to say safety's not an issue. But what we have to keep in mind is that that's a bogus argument, and we're going to have to cobble our comments to respectfully say that. And here's why it's a bogus argument. Remember, they're asking for 43 permanent authorized anchorages at all these various locations. You guys have the literature. I've seen vessels anchored at these locations at times when conditions warranted anchoring. So what I'm saying, it's like Sandy. During Sandy, I was up north, and I knew I wanted to spend the storm down in Ossining in my berth. I ran south to meet the storm, and all the commercial traffic in New York Harbor, many, not all, many ships in New York Harbor were ordered by the Coast Guard to go north. And they were anchored at Montrose, and at Verplank, and at Newburgh, and at Malden, and at Milton, and at Kingston, and at Hyde Park. The official and unofficial anchorages. All the spots that are delineated in this proposal, there were vessels. So, takeaway, they're known to be suitable anchorages, and the Coast Guard will allow them to be used when safety is an issue. In fact, they'll direct them to be used when safety is an issue. So what I said to the industry rep Monday night was, give us an example when the master of a tug or a ship has requested of the Coast Guard permission to anchor under duress or for any safety reason whatsoever and been denied. No answer. So we are going to have to deal with the assertion that this is all about safety, and we're going to have to try to find ways of saying, actually, they already have the safety built into the existing system. An authorization by the Coast Guard to use any one of these anchorages for temporary emergency use, I'm not sure we would have a problem with that, because that's the de facto situation right now. I'm not sure that members of the community would have a problem with temporary use for emergencies only. But the problem we have is in the proposal here is that these are being, the industry is asking for these to be authorized, and with the exception of one anchorage location only off Port Ewan, so one of the 3 sites in the Kingston hub, each one of them is specified as a long-term anchorage. A long-term anchorage. Now we have one of our staff, our legal staff at RIVERKEEPER, trying to dig into what the Coast Guard means when they print the words long-term. Is it long-term a week? Is long-term a month? Is long-term an indefinite stay? And there's a reason for asking this, obviously, right? But reasons that are not obvious, which I'm about to get into. All right, so for us, trying to examine what is this need, what is driving this request for 43 berths when they're using less than 6 year after year after year after year. We think it's all about oil. And we're not just making this up. In the letter, if I can get my fingers to work here, in the letter that the Coast Guard received from industry in September last year that set this in motion. And I need to say right here, for the record, for everyone to understand, a lot of the communities have started saying, you see posts where the Coast Guard is proposing these anchorages. The Coast Guard is the devil. And that's not the case at all. So bear with me, because this is very important. The Coast Guard actually is doing exactly what we want them to do here. They have come out with an advanced notice of a proposed rulemaking. They couldn't have given us more lead. They don't have to do what they've done. They could have just come out with a proposed rulemaking. They are allowing the community to comment to the fullest, as much as they can. And so at this point, until we have a reason to be upset with the Coast Guard, let's not be. Because the last thing we want is to give the Coast Guard the notion that the public has written them off unreasonably, and then they can dismiss our comments. So let's be careful. This is an industry proposal that the Coast Guard has brought to us for consideration. And as contrast, and this is a little heavy, a little history. As a contrast, back in 2012, New York State DEC and Governor Cuomo, without any public hearings whatsoever, allowed the throughput of crude oil in the Port of Albany to go from 450,000 gallons a year to just under 3 billion. No environmental impact statement, no public comments, no community meetings, in spite of the fact that this Bakken crude oil is the stuff that explodes in people's communities. When spilled in water is unrecoverable. We just had the accident in Canada where that village was incinerated, that community was incinerated. No environmental review by our state. So the Coast Guard is way out ahead of our own electeds on this issue. We wouldn't be discussing this if the state hadn't given the permission for that vast amount of oil to move down the Hudson. Okay, so back to what's the real need. In the industry's letter, which they sent to I want to read it to you because it's important to get the words right, which they sent to the Coast Guard that leads us to this discussion. They state as their statement of need, aside from safety, which we've already discussed, they get into safety quite a bit. The only other distinct need that they address here is they say, and I'm quoting, trade will increase on the Hudson River significantly over the next few years with the lifting of the ban on American crude exports for foreign trade, and these federally designated anchorages are key to supporting trade. Industry has identified the anchorages as needed to support specific aspect of trade, not stone, not scrap metal, not salt, crude oil. I think that was an ill-considered sentence to put in this, because that was fuel for us. But they identify it as a support for that specific trade. And so that brings us to why we cannot be sort of agnostic about this proposal, for a variety of reasons. Carolyn's going to talk about one, Andy's going to talk about others. I'm going to bring sturgeon into the picture here in just a second. But crude oil makes the fact that the industry is saying out loud that this is to support a vast increase in crude oil transport, and that export ban is significant. Up until the price of crude oil depressed and it stopped the flow. Recently, this flow has been a third or so of what it was into early 2015. When the price of oil goes back up, in the past, the amount of oil coming down the valley by train and by barge and ship was to support the refineries we have in Linden, New Jersey, and in Philly, our coastal refineries. There was no way to get the oil to go anywhere else. It couldn't be taken offshore. While the price was down in the last year, the export ban was lifted by federal government. That was in place since the oil crisis of decades ago. So now, oil companies are going to be able to send down the Hudson Valley everything that our coastal refineries can possibly use, and they're going to be able to load ships to send them abroad to other nations, and the only limit on it is what the market will bear. So what we thought was a lot is going to be the old days, and now we're going to know what a lot is. And so they're gearing up for it. Okay, so why do they need a bunch of barges? I hope I'm not getting too technical on you, but it's important for you to understand, because informed comments to the Coast Guard are going to be much more valuable than just, I'm angry about this. So all the barges anchoring off Rhinecliff and all the vessels anchoring at Hyde Park are all northbound vessels, all running light, looking to go north to load or discharge. But the only ones going north to discharge would be, let's say, a ship full of salt that's going north before winter to discharge, so we have road salt. The problem, the reason for the anchorages being used at Hyde Park and at Rhinecliff, Port Ewan, was northbound traffic waiting for congestion to open in the Port of Albany. So the takeaway for you here is congestion in the Port of Albany is a large driver for the Kingston hub, which is your ground zero, okay? The other issue, which we've already discussed, is the possibility of export of crude. So the anchorages are going to be needed for that. We don't know, because industry's not being square with us. Why are there 16 additional berths in Yonkers? There's no refinery in Yonkers. There's American Sugar, and they already anchor their sugar barge out there. Why 16 berths additionally in Yonkers? Because it's the closest anchorage to New York Harbor. So if a foreign tanker is going to come in to Stapleton Anchorage, and barges are going to go alongside and lighter off the crude oil to fill a ship, they're going to have to stage those barges somewhere. They're not going to stage them up here if they're going to discharge them into a waiting tanker in New York Harbor. They're going to stage them as close to New York Harbor as they can. That's the only possible reason for Yonkers to get 16 additional berths. We were there with a New York Times photographer the other day. There was 2 barges. Sometimes there's 3 barges. 2, 3, 1, none, 2, 1. 16 additional all of a sudden. So that has to be driven by some market force. The only thing we can think of is that those are going to be full barges loaded in Albany, waiting for a ship to take the fuel to go abroad. And the only other thing that we can consider, and this is not, again, just imaginary, is that Leah and I looked up some stories we had seen on NPR, and with the depressed price of crude oil nationwide, what's happening in the Gulf is ships that are idle because they're not being used to bring oil from traditional sources. They're sitting there empty. The producers want to get oil out of the ground because they want oil on hand when the price goes back up. So they're storing crude oil in ships because the shoreside tank farms, you know what I mean by a tank farm, you've seen them. There are these areas where there's all these big round tanks, all like a dozen of them or 20 of them or 30 of them. That's called a tank farm. Well, the tank farms are all full because the oil is coming out of the ground, and now they're using ships to store the material. There's a very real possibility that idle barges, which were working up until the fall of 2015 when the price dropped and the volumes moving reduced. Now these barges are sitting there empty, not moving, doing nothing, bringing no revenue. It's very possible that there's an intention to use protected waterway like the Hudson to store fuel until the price goes up. And again, we can give you copies of 2 articles going back into 2014 and 15, or 15 and 16, where this is in practice and underway in the Gulf of Mexico right now. When I confronted the industry guy with this possibility, he said, no, that's crazy. Why would we pay men to store fuel? Well, somebody ought to ask all the guys who are doing it in the Gulf. They're doing it because an empty barge brings no revenue. But if the barge is being used to store oil, the barge owner can charge the oil producer storage rent. So it's actually a moneymaker to store oil. So I know I'm covering a lot of material here. Is it making sense so far? Okay. I have to tell you, and then I may have overrun, but it's important. So here we are saying that we think that crude oil is a large factor here. We think this is all about oil. It's not about safety. It's not about anything else. It's about oil. Because that's the only thing that's changed. One of the things that we have to address, because you're going to hear it. People are going to say, as they did to you, well, you drive a car, right? You want salt on your roads, right? You want heating oil in your house, right? Okay. Keep in mind that for decades and decades and decades, petroleum has come north on the river, to terminals in Newburgh, to terminals in Kingston, to terminals in Catskill, to terminals in Albany. And this is refined product coming north. Refined product. Diesel, gas, heating oil. Not crude. So the northbound traffic and the consumption of those northbound refined petroleum products hasn't changed. Those barges are running today. They haven't changed because of the price of crude oil dropping. Because people still need to heat water. People still need to fuel their vehicles. And the number of people in the hinterland in northern New York State that rely on this network, this northbound network of refined product, they haven't suddenly disappeared. So there's a relatively stable northbound flow of refined product. It was there before crude oil started coming out of Dakota. So when people say, well, you want to drive your car, if you don't let the anchorages happen, you want to have fuel for your car, that's totally bogus. It's totally bogus. We're not saying don't produce oil, because we're not all going to turn our cars off tomorrow. But we are saying there are safer ways of transporting oil. There are alternatives to bringing it out of the ground in North Dakota and taking it to the coast where the refineries are. There's a rush to bring the oil out of the ground. A refinery could be built in North Dakota, and refined product could be delivered into the middle of the continent from a refinery in North Dakota. They're not going to do that because that takes time and money. So it isn't an argument about you drive your car, how can you protest the movement of crude oil? There are safer ways to move crude oil. This is America's founding river. There are overland ways of moving crude oil, and if the overland ways of moving crude oil are not safe enough at this point, then as a nation we have to say, hold production and let's build a safer way of moving the crude oil. It isn't like the Hudson or nothing. And so you have to find a way in your messaging to deal with that. The reason crude oil is so bad is, and it's different from refined product. In a gasoline spill, they don't even contain it. They let it flash off. In an ethanol spill, they let it flash off. In a diesel spill, they try to corral it, but it's such a light fuel, it floats, and a lot of the toxicity is out of it. Heating oil is like diesel fuel. Bakken is different. Bakken, although technically a floating oil, a floating crude, mixes with the water column very quickly in a moving river. So In 2012, we didn't have this answer. Neil and I, who's here, my colleague Neil, we were going to Coast Guard meeting and EPA meeting and spill response meeting after spill response meeting, and even the specialists said, this is a floating oil, we're going to be able to collect it. Well, then there were accidents in the Mississippi. For example, barge collision. Only 36,000 gallons spilled, which is tiny in a barge that holds 4 million. 36,000 gallons spilled. I think it was a 4 or 6 day response, and you will read about the response in the Gulf and the BP spill and the response, and it's all about response, and you'll see an army of vessels and boom and contractors come out to a spill. That's response. What you never read in the paper is the recovery. So it's like if the fire trucks all go to the fire and then they don't take the hoses out and the buildings burn down. The response was great. They got there. The trucks were shiny. The men were all in great new outfits. But if the buildings all burn down because they don't get there in time, it's a failure. And so the similar situation in spill response and recovery. In that 36,000 gallon spill in the Mississippi, ready? 90 gallons was recovered. So it's like there's no cash penalty to the oil spill recovery organizations. They are not paid to recover. They're paid to respond. So we have a real big problem here. We have accident after accident into moving water where 0 to a fraction of 1% was recovered, and that's what our system is. Then we have examples of, so if it gets into the water column, is it bad? Yes, it's bad. The Lac Megantic, which was that community in Canada, is next to a little river. If I remember correctly, Neil, it's La Chaudière River. And so a couple years after that accident, some biologists went and looked at the fish in that river. And they found something like, I don't have the study in front of me, it's going to be on our website very shortly on that post that we are building. Something like a 50% reduction in biodiversity in the river. And the bottom-dwelling fish were ill, had lesions. So here we have endangered species that live on the bottom, eel that live on the bottom that are stressed. We have all kinds of species that we have prioritized for recovery in the Hudson River, and we're running a product that, if spilled, can't be collected and is proven to cause problems for wildlife in the river. Not to mention that the 40% of it that flashes off into fumes, if it happens in your community, is mutagenic and carcinogenic, the fumes. So what I wanted to paint for you here is a picture of what the industry is asking for, the vast increase, what they say they're asking, what the reason they're publicly stating for that need is safety. And I'm giving you an argument that says it's not about safety, it's about money. And that's okay. That's okay for business to do business. That's okay. But business can't do business at the expense of others. We're not going to subsidize this business. The river isn't going to subsidize this business. The Hudson isn't going to get a nickel of revenue from these anchorages. Your communities aren't going to get there's no rent for an anchorage. Your communities are going to get nothing unless you have a couple of merchant seamen that live in town. And they're going to make money, granted. But you know, the Hudson has been the victim of industry for centuries. The shorelines were cut off by railroads. The marshes were strangled by railroad right-of-ways and riprap. GE dumped their poison in the river at Fort Edward. Power plants are built along the shore that use once-through cooling, and Indian Point itself, Indian Point alone kills 1 billion fish a year because it inhales 2.2 billion gallons of water a day. I mean, we can go on and on. Every community has a manufactured gas plant that's being cleaned up, like Poughkeepsie. There's one underway in Kingston right now, and coal tar is leaching out into the water. New York State Department of Health fish consumption advisory for the entire Hudson is women of childbearing years should eat no fish, children eat no fish. That didn't happen because of fishermen, it didn't happen because of carpenters, it happened because of industry. So what we're saying at Riverkeeper is that in response to the industry statement that this These anchorages have been used for eons. This is just the way it is. Ships anchor. Henry Hudson anchored. I was told one day that Henry Hudson was the first commercial operation on the Hudson. That may be true. I would think an Indian fishing from a canoe is also a commercial operation. But European commercial operation, we'll say. And so that's a good point. But we don't do everything the same over centuries. We used to whale. We used to dump all our sewage offshore, directly into the water. We used to dump all of New York City's garbage offshore. There are a whole bunch of things that we used to do that we don't do anymore. And we're suggesting that this reindustrialization that's proposed here for a product that is bad for us, bad for the river, and bad for the future in general, to your point, is not going to fly. Thanks.